Gabriel, does that sound okay?
Yes, that's great.
All
Thank you.
right, okay. Okay, excellent. All right, okay. Well, thank you everybody for being here. We're going to get started with our panel on um, um, queer and trans Marxism and internationalism. Okay, so I'm going to have the speakers introduce ourselves. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Woori. I'm based in the U University of Exeter in the UK. So I will co-present my paper with Boram. So yeah.
Hello, my name is Boram. I'm a member of the Center for Women's Culture and Theory in South Korea and Queers in Korea for Palestine. It's a pleasure to meet you all.
I'm Haotian Jiang, and you can call me Howard, and I'm an undergraduate student in Hong Kong Baptist University, and I'm interested in queer theory, and I'm really glad, Petrus Liu, you are here today because my work is generally a rethinking of your monograph, Queer Marxism into China in 2015. Yeah, very happy to see you here.
Uh, Thank you. Look forward to our conversation. Hi, I'm Petrus Liu. I teach Chinese and comparative literature and women's and gender studies at Boston University.
Do you want me to
Yep.
start? Yeah.
Okay, we're gonna start with the first presentation.
Great. Thank you so much. So yeah, I forgot to introduce myself, like my position. So I'm a lecturer at the University of Exeter, and I'm a feminist and queer media studies scholar. Okay, so thank you everyone for attending this virtual session. And then I'm so sorry for being unable to attend this session in person in New York City. But my co-presenter Boram and I are happy to present our work in progress on contemporary queer labor solidarity in South Korea. So this is a work in progress. So we are happy to, and we will be grateful for any kind of comment, question, critique from audience. And then this is the outline of today's presentation. And as some of you might know, Korea has recently been embroiled in a political crisis caused by the declaration of martial law by the right-wing President Yoon Suk-yeol in December 2024. Since then, democratic citizens organized and participated in more than 1,800 rallies across the nation over 4 months to protest for the presidential impeachment and against the rising right-wing forces. They successfully forced Yoon out of office in April 2025. More importantly, the rallies opened the scare for any participant, including those marginalized, to raise their voices through giving speeches, picketing, and organizing small rallies. These activities allowed participants to learn about the oppressions of feminists, sex workers, LGBTQ people, people with disability, farmers, and temporary workers under President Yoon's anti-feminist, anti-labor, anti-social minority policies. These protesters um, these protests enable participants to realize the otherwise invisible connections of intersectional oppressions. Against this backdrop, the Wasps comrade emerged as a new political subject, manifesting queer class solidarity. The Wasp comrade is a term derived from an internet name, wasp or hornet uncle, a beekeeper who ran to protect his precious honeybees from wasp attack. The wasp comrade refers to those who run to protect their precious, struggling workers, farmers, and people with disabilities, among others, whose political agenda the wasp comrade got to know for the first time through the anti-martial law protest. The term WASP was first used to refer to young people, including women, queer, and non-binary people in their 20s and 30s, who swiftly ran to protect hundreds of farmers on the street on a freezing day in December as the farmers' attempt to participate in protest in Seoul was blocked by police. So that's a farmer's tractor. And then even after the removal of President Yoon from office, these young people continue to engage with solidarity activities with the dismissed unionists by giving speeches at rallies, co-organizing rallies with workers, and even joining the unions without any workplace affiliations. In fact, solidarity building activity between laborers and queer people is not new in Korea, as Korean queer movements have built connections with labor movement at the personal, affective, and organizational level since queer movement beginning in the mid-1990s in Korea. Also, scholars focus on how the anti-martial law protest, dubbed as light stick protest, were led by young women and their embracing of K-pop fan culture as a medium for political expression in opposition to heteropatriarchy and capitalism. While building on the previous study's focus and point, our project finds that many of the Wasp comrades do not have ties to long-standing movement organization and refuse to identify with any existing gender, sexuality, or K-pop identity categories. For this reason, we employ the framework of queer materialism that exceeds identity politics and focuses on the social structuration of the self and the body. We examine how solidarity is forced between those who exceed the existing identity categories and analyze the political subjectivity of the Wasp comrade through the lens of geopolitics of corporeality and materiality. Liu argues that queerness not about a fluid identity, but about how subjectivity is produced through being haunted by social constraint and other material conditions that exceed knowledge of the self. And that is, as he said, Marx shows how reproduction of individual life is enabled by others' labor and social relations mediated by that labor. Butler similarly illustrates how individuals are entangled with others through their gendered bodies and how livability is enabled through mutual recognition of the self in relation to others. To borrow Bolan, inconvenience of the other people allows the self to acknowledge the trouble, confront the underlying structural problems, and seek alternative solutions. Drawing on this point, we use the lens of body and materiality that are shaped by and shape social relations to examine the entanglement of wasp and the laborer. So our project is based on participant observation through attending multiple protests in 2024 and 2025, while referencing news media and movement organizations' interview with the Wasp comrade. So in what follows, we first focus on the body as a medium of resistance, and then illustrate how the flags, the protesting material, play a key role in reshaping social relations. And then we finally share our ideas to advance this project. The protesting bodies have blocked the armored vehicle during the martial law, as you can see from the photo, and they gathered in support of the farmers to confront police and brave the freezing temperature and snowy night to protest against the President Yoon outside his residence. This example illustrates that these bodies have transformed into a medium of resistance through collectivity and interconnectedness. Here, these bodies do not construct a homogeneous social body, but reveal a relationality of a social body that is power based on being together and connection. The transformation offers new political agency and the foundation of hope. For example, young people who stay up all night with farmers witnessed how bodily collectivity enabled the protection, care, and survival for the marginalized from the freezing weather and the police crackdown. And they also found that the relationality of these bodies constitute a protesting body as a political subject, especially when they felt that they were exchanging baton with other citizens who came to protesting site the following morning to enable those who stayed all night to return home and also to manifest protest. The phrase the baton exchange suggests the interdependent bodies have the power to challenge the oppressive structure, creating the subjectivity of the wasp comrade. Here, being called wasp, the wasp comrade, and becoming and doing a wasp, catalyze connection among different bodies. producing performative effect. So like a wasp quickly flying across the boundaries, the bodily movement of the wasp comrade blurred a fine line between ordinary spaces of average citizen and the side of resistance and unionist. When wasps come to the side of protests such as that of these high altitude sit-in protests, to share meals with the workers, give flowers to them, and exercise together. So here to draw Munoz, the wasp comrades are feeling together in difference. So while seeking to find a similar experience with the farmers and dismiss the workers, the wasp comrades also identify with and distance from, run about, entertained by, and care about difference from others. In doing so, they expanded networks with other wasp comrades and workers through their bodies, thereby challenging capitalism and governments that divide and isolate social minorities. The bodily solidarity reconfigures public spaces and thereby the sense of self. As Butler argues, the occupation of the space is enabled by people whose bodies rely on co-presence and the networks of other bodies, and the occupation counters the norms around dominant spatial configuration. Now, the gender binary public spaces are reconfigured when the unionists prepared gender-neutral public bathroom at the protesting site, and bleak urban infrastructure such as CCTV tower and traffic control tower, where the dismissed workers set in to demand reinstatement, have become effectively resonant public spaces for the wasp comrade, especially when they felt guilty about their free working while caring about the workers confined in the towers. So this relational and social corporeality challenges the dominant neoliberal ideas of the body as the property governed by the sovereign subject, thereby having form of coalition of precarious lives. So in the following section, Boram will continue the presentation.
Hi, I will now continue with my presentation. The materials closely associated with the WASP comrades include flags. During the anti-martial law protest, the so-called whimsical protest flags emerged in stark contrast to the South Korean and American flags carried by far-right protesters. The exemplar whimsical flags include the introvert flag, Fireman 정대만, referring to a manga character representing perseverance, and the Union of Magical Girls Busan chapter. These kinds of flags symbolize Flagbearers' spontaneity and wit, qualities that far-right forces could never imitate. In this sense, they came to represent democracy itself. Carrying these kinds of flags, the WASP comrades moved to protesting sites that need solidarity beyond the anti-martial law protests. At the sites of worker struggles, the flags of the WASP comrades outnumber those of labor unions and social movement groups. We conceptualize the flags in this protest as a kind of physical hashtag. With this concept, we understand the flag as an actant and the agency of the flag bearers as a form of distributive agency. Hashtags are a form of metadata on social media, combining the hash symbol with a specific word or phrase. They catalyze user interaction and enhance the searchability and visibility of social media posts that use particular hashtags, thereby producing collective discourse and framing them as important. First, as a physical hashtag, the protest flags connect the online public with the offline world. During the protest calling for the president's resignation, the bodily gathering was crucial as a medium of resistance. The silly, whimsical flags worked as a kind of invitation, encouraging people online to come out to the square, even if they had never joined the protest, to see the appealing and relatable flags like the introvert flag on the street. In this sense, the protest flags were made not just to express personal interest, but to foster a sense of commonality among people. This is why the flag of fandom of subcultures like the 정대만 flag can become political. The connectivity inside fandoms can be transformed into collectivity for political action. At that point, the flag bearer is no longer just an anonymous social media user, but becomes a mediator between the online and offline worlds. Second, the flag enhances visibility. Just as a hashtag makes a post more visible, a flag marks flag bearers' presence as more visible at a protesting site without revealing their names or social status. The creation of playful flags is also connected to the subculture of creating a self-embodying original character or take. In original character communities, the character becomes the protagonist while the person who creates that character is pushed into the background. Similarly, the flag becomes the visible main body, and the flag bearer becomes its invisible creator. This interesting relation between the flags and people carrying the flags is illustrated by some flag bearers' comment that they would not go to protest sites without their flags. In other words, the flags move the human bodies. This shows that agency does not stem from a single subject alone, but is distributed across the relations between people and objects. Third, the protesting flags create space. The flags help the protesters identify others with a similar political agenda among countless heterogeneous participants at the sites of anti-martial law protests, thereby creating a new political space to promote their political agenda. For example, feminists and queer individuals gathered around the different iterations of rainbow flags and feminist flags carried by queer feminist individuals and activists. This gathering created the so-called feminist zones and rainbow zones, which were safer for queer people and feminists and enabled them to raise their voices about gender equality and LGBTQ rights as part of social transformation beyond impeachment. The Palestinian flags carried by the Wasp comrades and pro-Palestine activists drew people's attention to genocide. In this sense, making, displaying, and waving flags shows us how creativity can elevate political depression and frustration caused by President Yoon's anti-democratic power abuse, move the Wasp comrades' bodies, bring them together in specific ways, and carve out space. It is a form of world making that offers an alternative to existing thoughts, emotions, and actions, and makes a concrete utopia possible. Now I want to turn to the solidarity between workers in high-altitude sit-in protests and the Wasps comrades from the perspective of queer Marxism. Unlike liberal identity politics, which focuses on correcting discrimination and embracing diversity without questioning the capitalist system and power relations, the politics of workers and Wasps has pointed out that the capitalist system operates through discriminatory hierarchies and has resisted the violence of capital. Starting with the protest demanding presidential impeachment, the Wasp comrades have experienced bodily solidarity shaped by the material structures that organize their precarious lives, and they have developed ways of creating a new public space and a counter-public by relying on one another's bodies and material resources. For example, the culture festival at the 3 sites of high-altitude protests, our own Mini Mary Queer Parade, jointly organized by the Wasp comrades and the 3 labor unions, demonstrated the entanglement of queer people and the working class. The participants chanted, "There are queer people among workers and there are workers among queer people." The speech given by a sexual minority Wasp comrade illustrated such a point, describing the reason many trans people work at shopping mall warehouses is that it is only in such a harsh and undesirable working condition that trans people can avoid discrimination. Realizing how being a worker and being queer are not separate, but deeply intertwined by capitalism, the participants shared a sense of collectivity and solidarity that challenged the capitalist power that erases the entanglement. We believe this is where we need to develop queer theory and queer politics. The prevalent discourses around the anti-martial law protests were that women in their 20s and 30s holding light sticks saved K democracy, and that precarious young people are simply filling the gap left by the bureaucratized labor movement consisting of old men. However, from our observation, the queer class relationship shown by the WASP comrades can be understood as a form of activism and agency that emerges from the new material conditions created by the expansion of precarious labor. Most of the WASPs are college and graduate students and temporary workers in precarious jobs, such as private tutors, who even work on their laptops for their part-time jobs at the protesting sites to show solidarity with the workers. WASPs stand in solidarity and fight for a world where no one is discriminated against, a world that can be imagined through queer Marxism. Marx described the experience of workers being violently alienated from their products, their communities, and their very nature as human beings. When farmers tell the WASP comrades about the global food production structure and about how the colonization of the countryside is once linked to the lives of urban residents, the WASPs learn about totality without even reading Marx. To conclude, workers' WASP solidarity is a collective act of critical engagement with a world that causes me incomprehensible distress. Developing this work in progress, we are working to expand our discussion of queer class relations by interviewing WASPs, labor union members, and other social movement activists. We will further examine the WASP comrades' social, cultural, and political backgrounds and effective motivations and the ways in which the union-based labor movement and queer and feminist movements have been reshaped. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Thank you so much, Boram and Woori, for that enlightening talk on the flag as an act of social solidarity. All right. Okay. So I will present next, and my presentation. Let me see if I can screen share. Okay, is this okay? Everybody see it? All right, okay. So thank you. It is an honor to be part of this extraordinary conference, and I want to thank my co-panelists and the conference organizers, especially Matt Brim, for making this possible. My talk today aims to do two things. First, I want to provide some reflection on my 2023 monograph, The Spectre of Materialism, in the context of today's panel topic on queer and trans Marxism and internationalism. The second half of my talk will address a new research project I'm working on, which has to do with specifically what happens to this question when we approach issues of transnationalism and Marxism and queerness from the point of view of value. So in the broadest terms, my aim is to generate a non-Eurocentric version of queer theory grounded in the historical experiences and collective wisdom of intellectuals outside the global north, to expand the archive of references for what we recognize as theory in the humanities. My second concern has to do with the so-called materialist turn, or what I'm describing today as the value turn within queer theory. In recent years, queer theory appears to have made a materialist turn away from questions of representation and performativity to those of dispossession, precarity, and differential distribution of life chances. Despite this shift, queer theory finds itself constantly reabsorbed into the liberal project of diversity management. The theoretical and political weakness, I argue, stems from an incomplete understanding of capitalism's contemporary transformation, of which China has been at the center. My third claim is that I want to challenge key premises of classic queer theory and Marxism together by turning to an analysis of the Beijing Consensus, which I characterize as global capitalism's latest mutation, in order to develop a new theory of the political economy of sexuality. I explore how relations of gender and sexuality get reconfigured to meet the needs of capital in new regimes of accumulation and dispossession, demonstrating that evolving US-Asian economic relations shape the emergence of new queer identities and academic theories. In so doing, I offer a new history of collective struggles that provides a transnational framework for understanding the nexus between queerness and material life. So let me now turn to my first main point about the materialist turn in queer theory. We live in a time when being queer itself is no longer queer enough. Academic conferences and publications clustering around questions of what is queer about queer studies now, what is left of queer after queer theory, or simply after sex, suggests either the demise of the field or a conviction in the usefulness of its remains. In the case of the latter, the consensus seems to be that whatever is left, in the double sense of what is left wing and what remains, of queer theory must be radicalized through re-engagement with materialist questions such as racial oppression and distributive justice. The materialist turn. Now, instead of single themed approaches to gay and lesbian history or cultures, we now find an increasing number of intersectional studies situating queerness in contexts as diverse as anti-Black racism, assisted reproductive technologies in the global South, the rise of humanitarian security regimes, resistance to austerity politics, and the neoliberal logic of homonationalism by adopting a host of materialist concepts, including the neoliberal state, the maldistribution of life chances, and the global precariat. Contemporary queer theory is calling for a new political optic for understanding the intersectionality of gender anti-normativity and material stratification. Though 1990s queer theory was generally perceived as the reflection of a linguistic turn in the humanities, in fact, the study of gender and sexuality has always been haunted by materialism. Contemporary queer theory is imbued with an ever greater sense of urgency that this anti-normative project must evolve from the linguistic deconstruction of gender norms to a collective transformation of the existing systems that produce these constructions or make certain constructions count more than others in the first place. The crisis-ridden era of the post-2008 years supplied palpable evidence that progressive queer theory wants to be more materialist. Increasingly, new scholarly projects are bringing questions of political economy and the state back into a conversation that was once dominated by a hermeneutics of suspicion crafted in the post-structuralist idioms of deconstruction and psychoanalysis. Yet, queer critiques of neoliberal capitalism rarely address key Marxist concepts such as abstract labor, expanded reproduction, the organic composition of capital, the falling rate of profit, the transformation problem, or primitive accumulation. To the extent that queer theory glances worriedly at class, it conducts its anti-capitalist critique mostly through a moralizing language against privilege or discrimination. In other words, though new queer theory declares itself to be materialist, it shares more in common with mainstream progressive liberalism than Marxism. Consequently, the focus of contemporary queer anti-capitalist analysis remains more centered on denouncing US corporate greed and reified desire than on understanding capitalism as a system, that is, as the transnational subsumption of labor in the global South. If we are correct to say that Marxism has remained an underutilized resource in the current critical scene of queer anti-capitalism, the revolutionary experience and Marxist theories of China's actually existing socialism, as well as the way the formerly socialist country became the world's second largest capitalist economy today, are simply forgotten. Neoliberal capitalism is a phrase that trips easily off the tongue, but without a theory of the geographical process of capital accumulation and dispossession, it has served more polemical than analytical purposes in queer theory. The year 1990 is remembered by many as the annus mirabilis of queer theory. In addition to the publication of Judith Butler's Gender Trouble, Hoppering's years of homosexuality, and Eve Sedgwick's Epistemology of the Closet, 1990 also saw the very coinage of the term queer theory as the title of a conference at UC Santa Cruz. But 1990 was also the year when a new economic relationship of mutual vassalage between America and China began to take shape, one that would eventually lead commentators to speculate in the wake of the 2007 to 10 subprime mortgage crisis that an alternative Chinese economic model called the Beijing Consensus, with its huge holdings of the US government debt, productive capacity, and high savings rates, would enable the formerly socialist country to displace the United States as the center of global capitalism. In 1989, while American academics were busy finalizing the inaugural texts of what would come to be known as queer theory, the rest of the world was in revolutionary fervor. With unprecedented spontaneity and scope, the 1989 Tiananmen Square demonstrations in China sent shock waves through the socialist world that catalyzed the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. If the global capitalist order seemed temporarily stable, in the mid-20th century, with the mass consumption market backed up by American military hegemony, by the birth year of queer theory, it has come undone by surges of anti-systemic movements around the globe. The prolonged period of stagflation and decline in the rate of capitalist profit, which Robert Brenner identifies as having begun in 1965 to 1973, induced a flexible mode of accumulation that relocated American capital to China and other low-wage sites for new rounds of expansion to counter the effects of underconsumption, rising production costs, and labor unrest. With newly established subcontracting networks, American corporations outsourced the manufacturing of low-value added products to China and turned it into the factory of the world. Let me just check on time. I think that might be all the time I have, actually. Okay. All right. Okay. So I will just very, very quickly say that okay. All right. That while the capitalist production has become rationalized and globalized, our regime of accountability has not. What is unevenly distributed is not just our vulnerability, but also our sense of proximity, whose lives matter, whose lives are worth protection and recognition, and who belongs to this collective us versus them. Bodies come together sometimes erratically, and sometimes across borders. But bodies are also laboring and producing values that we consume, living in relation to hierarchies we create, and thinking in differentially valued traditions and languages. Queer bodies exist in a state of constant tension with the instrument of capital accumulation, including a citizenship system that confers legal rights based on birth accidents and monogamous marriages, an institution of private property enshrined in idealized forms of kinship and descent, and the reproduction of families as neoliberal consumers and racially segregated access to healthcare, housing, and means of subsistence. To be queer, to inhabit a queer body, means that one must rebel against capitalism's laws of value and their regulation of gender and sexual norms. Thank you very much.
All right, here we go. I think we have a smooth transition because I'm just going to talk about your 2015 monograph. Um, so Queer Marxism in Two Chinas by Petrus. Okay, so for some who may not be that familiar with Liu's incomparable contribution to queer Marxism in China or in Asia, may I do a brief introduction? So he argues that he challenges the view that queer culture is a product of capitalism and neoliberalism. He argues that Marxism as a methodology rather than an ideology inspires queer theories, artists, and social activists to analyze gender, sexuality, power, labor, and capital in the Chinese context. He stands for a non-liberal path against Eurocentric queer theories focused on identity politics, consumption, and formal legal equality. In his view, the ideological competition between two regimes across the Taiwan Strait provided a unique impetus for queer discourse, and I think this is the reason that this book is titled as so. And he analyzes the pain economy and homonormativity under globalization, the tendency for queer people to be assimilated into respectable middle-class consumers. The reception of this book is generally good, while there are also critiques. So Bao Hongwei argues that in setting up a dichotomy between China and the West, Liu also risks creating an imaginary of a transnational China that is isolated from the global circulation of queer knowledge and practices, thus reinforcing a China exceptionalism popular in the traditional area studies paradigm. And Jiang notes that in his book, the coverage of queer cultural materials from mainland China is much thinner than its examination of queer cultures from Taiwan. He also notes that the queer Marxists discussed in his book are exclusively achieving writers and intellectuals and famous artists and activists, where being a queer Marxist seemed to be a privilege only affordable by a small handful of social elites. Zhao Hui even comments, with the exception of Cui Zi'en's works, I'll elaborate on his filmmaking by the end. It seems that most of the materials come from Taiwanese sources. It might be more appropriate to call his book Queer Marxism in Taiwan instead. Well, in my point of view, there's indeed a connection between queer discourses on the mainland and in Taiwan. So it makes sense to discuss them together, because Taiwan has always served as a template for mainland Chinese imagination of an alternative China. Therefore, mainland LGBTQ plus individuals tend to imagine a casual relationship between Taiwan's liberal environment and the successful fight for equal rights for LGBTQ plus, thus deeply stick to queer liberalism. LGBTQ plus people in mainland generally view Taiwan as an ideal model, especially after 2017, because of the legalization of same-sex marriage. Meanwhile, because Taiwanese who fought for same-sex marriage also view the West as an ideal model, so there is a structure. The alienation of LGBTQ plus in mainland China from official Marxism makes them highly susceptible to sliding to the extremes of neoliberalism and Eurocentrism. However, there are still counterexamples in mainland China resisting the tendency. So one points out that the prevailing Western LGBTQ plus activism is based on public visibility and coming out, and not always applicable in non-Western countries. This often overlooks the complex historical dynamics between the grassroots activism and the state governance, especially in the context of changing national and geopolitical conditions. In recent years, Chinese activists have moved away from blindly pursuing a singular Western development model. They have realized that an overemphasis on visibility is no longer suitable for the current environment. They have begun to utilize invisibility as a survival strategy, like practice primarily low visible service-based work operating at the margins of China's legal and policy framework. This is against the Western perspectives that emphasize calling for coming out or whatever. Instead of taking a radical approach, they attempt to reconcile non-normative sexual identity with Chinese kinship. But despite the emergence of decolonial and anti-neoliberal, anti-Eurocentric alternatives, queer Marxism remains absent when it comes to the lived experiences of ordinary queer people. So Chinese LGBTQ plus activists and individuals and people focus on same-sex marriage, imagine a post-Stonewall spectacle. Neoliberal cooptation and the pink economy are two subjects discussed in Liu's monograph. When queer visibility is tied to middle-class consumption, it loses its emancipatory potential. It obscures structural inequalities, such as the urban-rural division and class exploitation, creating a pseudo-queer identity. Tom argues that transnational mobility has become a new homonormative value, interplaying with the neoliberal desire. Huang and Wang argues that the economy of visibility in the emerging paint market shapes the queer landscape in mainland China. Queer visibility in Chinese media manifests as a narrative commodity that is embedded in consumerism and in colonialist sexual discourse. The expression of queer identity is confined to specific spaces, especially those related to consumption, which in turn undermines queer visibility and the possibility of expressing queer identity on a broader level. Low examines the ways in which lesbians' economic and intimate lives are closely intertwined amid neoliberal development in the urban landscape. It is observed that the market is experienced by lesbians as a site of queer agency and vulnerability under neoliberalism in contemporary China. And the commodified forms of intimacy through which lesbians actively engage in the labor market and queer-targeted pink market in order to develop their intimate relations, intimatized forms of commodification. It discusses homonormative division of labor, arguing that a homonormative division of labor exists within China's HIV economy and LGBT activism. This structure relies on the intimate labor of precarious lower-class queer individuals to maintain the economic and political frameworks of LGBT liberalism. It is also highlighted how the essential, often dirty and trivial social reproductive work performed by the queer community, such as peer education, caretaking, and HIV testing, is erased or devalued by the state, mainstream media, and even professionalized LGBT activism. It cautions against using narrowly defined Western concepts like resistance or community. Instead, it it was advocated for a South-focused political economy that connects sexuality and bodies to transnational labor divisions and local precarity. So telling the story of Lao Bali, namely Old Paris,
Uh,
it discusses
Sure.
the
Howard, are you your
Mhm,
slides are not advancing, just so you know. We're only
mhm.
looking at the same slide. Did you want it to move?
Oh, it's the same side?
Yeah, it's always the same slide.
Really? You should remind me.
Yeah,
Let
sorry.
me check.
Are you sharing from your screen?
Yeah. And can see now and like.
Yeah, now it's moving. Yeah, sorry about that.
Oh, you should remind me earlier. Okay. Okay. So through the story, uh, discussed LGBT movements, professionalize and focus on rights-based advocacy, and the tedious everyday work of HIV intervention is left to the lower class and migrant 同志, who are often viewed as a surplus or litter of the market economy. Taking it a step further, in contemporary China, the queer community is in the process of transitioning from invisibility to high visibility. While viewed through the lens of French Marxist guideboard, this faces a spectacular trap. Queer life is transformed into the image of consumption when queer identity is reduced to specific consumer settings. Bars, clubs, saunas, bathhouses, etc., and individuals affirm their identity through the consumption of symbols under the allure of desire that has been turned into a spectacle, and the commodified queer subjectivity is lost. So queerness is reduced to a commodity. If you do not participate in the spectacle of consumption, you seem to lose your visibility within the community. Neoliberalism confines queer life to specific consumption spaces, which are designed with the aim of having you consume while affirming your queer identity. So it has no freedom, has merely permitted indulgence, self-isolation within the spectacle. So we explore the relationship between the consumer revolution and the formation of LGBTQ plus spaces, saunas, bathhouses, bars, gyms in contemporary China. It posits that urban consumption acts as a catalyst for the production of desire spaces, and unconventional desires are mapped onto the urban landscape through commercial and social activities. Liu analyzes gay bars as consumption spaces and explores the underlying social dynamics of the Chinese LGBTQ plus community, distinguishing two layers of activity within these spaces. So the light side is tangible consumption. It includes the purchase of drinks, snacks, and watching performances such as masculine men dances or drag shows. Drinks often serve merely as a ticket or threshold for entry rather than the primary goal. The dark side is symbolic consumption. It refers to the fulfillment of deeper needs, such as identity construction, social interaction, and the pursuit of desire. Positing that the dark side is the primary reason for the popularity of gay bars. So the board posed three concepts as three ways of practice for resistance. So first is diffuse, to deliberately create temporary, non-commodified moments of life, enabling people to reclaim their subjectivity over their lives. Second is detournement, to appropriate of mainstream symbols, which are deconstructed and reassembled to generate new anti-establishment meanings. And third is construction of situations to create non-commodified pure moments based on solidarity rather than consumption. So map to Treason's filmmaking as a queer Marxist practice, as discussed in Petrus' work. So through improvisation, Cui transformed filmmaking from a production task into a democratized, spontaneous, creative exchange, liberating actors and directors from their predetermined roles as laborers who were separated from the means of production and products and alienated. One of the political aims of improvisation is to prevent the queer viewer from identifying with the character. And the boss concept of the spectacle precisely relies on including emotional projection in the audience. Through material rawness and narrative discontinuity, Cui creates a sense of diffuse that compels the audience to shift from a mode of consumption to a mode of reflection. So it appropriates and subverts mainstream narratives such as family and father-son relationships, using offbeat and surreal scenes to dismantle the audience projection onto the identification with middle-class queer life, thus achieving the tournament. So its non-script filming style rejects the standardized production norms of Soviet realism and Hollywood mode, allowing actors and the director to forge authentic connections on set through the construction of situations.
Sorry, we're still on the same slide.
Still same slide?
Yeah, we're now on
Yes.
pseudo queerness.
Well, let me check again. Oh, I don't know why it is not sharing.
You might have to manually.
All right.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So queer liberation does not only lie on to be incorporated into existing systems, homonormativity, but rather aiming to abolish the categories that give rise to these inequalities. So as we know, future research should move beyond elite circles to focus on the survival of sex workers and marginalized queer people and reintegrate gender sexuality issues into class and material analysis. Okay, and thank you for listening, and sorry for not showing my slides.
All right. Okay, thanks, everybody. Okay, we have until 11:30. Is that correct? Do we have time for Q&A or? All right. Okay. Then let's take some questions from the audience. We DPM. Sorry, what does that mean? Oh, okay. Okay, thank you. Yeah, okay. Thank you, Matt. Okay, I'm happy to discuss that, but I also don't want to, make this whole panel, about me and my work, because I think what is so interesting is, for an occasion like this is for, all of us, who have worked on different archives and histories to come together and reflect on common theoretical and conceptual issues. In Korea and in North America in from the point of view of different activist groups. So maybe I'll save that for later. I'll maybe just say one thing, as Matt is kindly typing up other questions, I hope. I think one thing I heard from the conversation today has to do with the fluidity and openness of the category of queer. And I think a lot of us are not just trying to think about the connections between queerness and identity politics and class issues, but also, how to mobilize the very category of queer and for what purpose. And I was really struck by um, Howard's presentation just a minute ago, where we talk about the tendency um, to think of queerness, the difference between starting from a form of queerness as solidarity as opposed to consumption. And I think, that yes, there has been a long-standing history and problem when we kind of, connected different forms of gender and sexual marginality to middle-class consumption. And then the opposite of that is of course, now we're kind of basing, our advocacy and senses of, precarity from our relationship to kind of consumerism, to what we can or cannot buy. And I actually also heard, versions of the same idea in Boram and Woori's presentation, when we talked about the flag, as um, definitionally not individual. It is not an expression of your individual identity or who you are, but a meme, a mode of social solidarity um, across identity categories and across most of embodiment. So maybe we can start thinking about queerness as solidarity rather than as oppression or as evidence of experience or as a descriptor of identity of any of one kind or another. And that would be kind of, I think, a common argument that all four of us are making in one way or another today.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for summarizing our presentation and then making connection and bridge between the presentation today across that actually, yeah, really helpful. So as we draw on Leo's work and then other queer Marxist and queer materialist and queer leftist scholarship, so we try to understand how these self-identifying and then the wasp or someone called hornet, this hornet comrade kind of recreate the sense of queerness because they do not necessarily identify as a queer people. Sometimes they just want to be seen as just a wasp or hornet or just the people, individual who make solidarity with working class people who are also in protesting. So here, but the kind of insight, kind of insight that we draw from the Liu and the other Petrus and other people's queer people's scholarship is that actually queerness is not just about whether you are queer or not, but rather it is more about kind of creating new social relations. Because queerness is about always queerness is about some kind of a disjointed kind of status or relations or some kind of out of joint or disarticulation from the what is going on. So considering this kind of relations, how these kind of feelings of and the sense of disjointness or disarticulation or disorientation can be kind of created, and then that is obviously related to the kind of social and material condition that construct these people and then their people and their social position. So that's the kind of a beginning of our research project, and then that is obviously different from the some kind of a liberal tendency in South Korea in identity-based politics. So that's why we try to focus on these queer, this comrade, was comrade or honor comrade, through the lens of queer materialism, especially focusing on materiality and then corporeality. And Boram, do you want to add something more?
Uh, Sambo?
Hi, Uri. Nice to see you. I have a question about your fieldwork or ethnography, I would say, in Korea, because I think in your presentation you only mentioned about the flags, but I know that the light sticks and like the slogans, other kind of visual, visuality or forms of visuality, they are so prominent, apart from the flags you are analyzing in this paper. So can you talk more about like light sticks and I'm also interested in how like this kind of K-pop identity entangles with this kind of the building of queer solidarity. And there are always the disputes within the community, right? Like maybe sometimes queer solidarity or queer activism, they don't want to, incorporate this kind of K-pop identity. But also sometimes K-pop fandoms, they don't want to be co-opted by queer activism as well. The NCT, like the lightstick scandal, if you know. So can you talk more about the modes of visuality and also this kind of competencies within the building or the making of queer solidarity in this kind of multi-crisis time in Korea?
Yeah, thank you. And actually, a flag is the kind of main topic, main analytical kind of a subject for Boram. For Boram, do you want to say something first, and then maybe I can add later? Hmm?
Sorry, I need more time.
Okay, so yeah, I think I can briefly provide some of my thought. So I believe that actually there's for those who do not like have a like previous knowledge about South Korean political crisis and protest, there was actually a very kind of active public discourses around these kind of young women who are holding this light stick as a kind that is a kind of item for K-pop culture, K-pop fan culture, and then these K-pop fans use their like a light stick for their favorite singer. They bring those items to the protest and then use them to kind of show that some kind of a peaceful kind of symbol that kind of a symbolize peacefulness of this protest, and then kind of showing how this protest is comprised of these individuals that have shows their personal interest, their personal kind of favorite, personal test, etc. And then the kind of public discussion, especially the recent kind of discussion made by sociologist Lung Lee. So she talks about how this kind of K-pop fan culture, especially young women who have been marginalized in the political discourse, even though they are continuously political subject in the very important Korean democratic protest, especially when they are recently affected by the recent feminist movement and queer movement. They are constantly marginalized in the broader discussions of political discussion. And then the symbol of this kind of light stick, and then what K-pop fan culture, and then K-pop fan cultures that usually kind of involve some kind of forms of like fans just staying up night to kind of wait for the concert, or just in line to kind of get a like a good view of their stars, etc. at concert, etc. Those kind of a K-pop fan culture also kind of influenced also kind of transplanted this kind of a protest culture. That's a kind of a public discussions around this light protest. And then the reason why we focused on flag instead of elastic is because there's a lot of discussions around them, and then mostly the discussion is about like how these young women kind of combine and integrate their personal interest and their personal identity into the broader discussions of pro-democracy and anti kind of authoritarian or anti-right-wing movement. But while thinking about like and then building on this kind of point, what we try to say, what try to consider further is that like how these women are actually just not women, and many of these West comrades do not identify as a woman. They identify as a non-binary, as they don't identify either any kind of human kind of being. So considering this kind of like a framework, the framework of identity that is not relevant, not is suitable for this kind of analytical, analyze these new emergent political subject. That's we might want to focus on what actually was comrade carry most of them kind of carry this flag instead of course, some of them carry the less deep, but some of them are really carry this kind of flag as kind of a very interesting material and item. So that's why we focused on, this issue, and then how that actually constructing new social relations like surrounding these flags. So that's we try to focus on. Sorry for the long lengthy answer. Yeah.
And also, I think K-pop, like, I think it's, in terms of the K-pop market in a global scale, on a global scale, it's hyper like capitalist and super like market driven. And I think that might counter the point of queer solidarity, like to if we count the K-pop context in this like study. So can we understand that as a kind of counterpoint to, dematerialize or, decapitalize the K-pop industry in this point?
So maybe we can think about like queering the public discussions or scholarly discussions around the queering K-pop, and then we can kind of expand the discussions around queering K-pop further, like combining and articulating with the queer Marxism or queer materialism or queer materialist view of K-pop. That's the kind of a very interesting take we can think about, like through the looking at the examples of these kind of a pro-democratic and then like K-pop activism. Yeah, thank you for the comment.
All right. We have more questions in the chat, and I think the second question is also directed at Woori and Boram, and it's about, wasps, um, and the slowness of disabled bodies. But to give you some time, to think, and craft your answer. Maybe I'll take the last question, which is easier, first. And the question is about, the relationship between queer materialism, which we have been invoking as a term at the panel, and how is it connected with Marxism, and is it opposed to psychoanalysis? I would say that no, it is not, and obviously it depends on who you're talking to and what you're talking about. But in my book, I talk about three different competing definitions of the material. Um, and on the one hand, the concept of the material sometimes refers to the body, the materiality of the body, and it is a question of whether the body or if parts of the body are linguistically constructed or not. So it is a legacy of the debate about construction versus social construction versus essentialism. And on the other hand, there is a separate debate um, um, uh, about determination and causality, and specifically about economic determination. And sometimes the term materialism is referring to historical materialism in traditional Marxism. And then there is the question of empiricism. So some people who do research in areas of gender and sexuality studies, emphasize history and empirical data. Some people are doing more conceptual and speculative work. Um, and that tension is sometimes framed as an opposition between materialist versus anti-materialist approaches as well. So I think there's no single definition of materialism, because materialism is almost always defined in relation to what it is not, unless you're writing in some kind of orthodoxy, and I think those people are actually relatively rare. So it is not always connected with Marxism, and it's definitely not opposed to psychoanalysis for sure. Okay, embodiment and corporeality.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the question, Robert, and about that's a really great point. And then so the briefly to give the kind of a case how this WASP comrade kind of build a solidarity with people with disability activists is that this was there's a ongoing activism by disabled people, especially when the public transformation prevented from people with disability. The public transformation prevented the people with disability from moving freely, especially using public transportation such as a subway, etc. And then actually the Seoul kind of station subway company did not want to install kind of a lift or elevator for the people with disability. And then disability activists kind of tried to challenge that kind of prevention, and then by occupying the spaces like a subway station in a very crowded time. And then WASP comrade came to know about this kind of issue through the participating anti-martial law protest, and then they quickly ran to the protesting side of these disability activists fighting for their right to move and then right to use of the public transformation. And then I think that is a really can be we couldn't actually didn't much analyze this issue, but we can think about how these quickly moving WASP bodies actually have the power and forces to these disability activists to kind of fight against the subway station, subway kind of companies, kind of security guard, and then state members when this security guard kind of prevented to disable the people from entering to subway like a vehicle, and then and also how this kind of a combined body or like an interconnected body create some power to challenge these things, especially when a subway station, the subway company ignore this disabled activists completely when they don't have like a solidarity power, the people power. So we can think about this thing, and also, and then with this kind of a combination or this solidarity can kind of create some kind of movement as well, kind of helping these disabled activists to kind of move together as well. So that's the kind of a very nascent idea of when we think about the connection with the slowness and quick speedy or speed, and then the politics of corporeality. And thank you so much for the great point. And then Boram, do you want to add something about this point, which I didn't elaborate further, couldn't.
There are not much time, but the WASPs were shocked to witness people with disabilities being brutally dragged away by the police and subway company, and they themselves have experienced the same violence. The WASPs' mobility and their spirit of going wherever they are called have created a form of solidarity that did not exist before martial law. I believe the WASP's politics, which overcome this divide and conquer strategy and blur boundaries, are truly important.
Great. Okay, I think that's all the time we have. So thank you all so much for coming to our panel, and thanks again to Matt and to our fabulous panelists.
Thank you organizing this conference, Matt, and then thank you for like chairing this session, Petrus.